Hey there, 5th grade. So we're going to be reading the next 2 chapters of The Monsters of Morley Manor. Last we were in the Land of the Dead, and Ivanoma, the kind of fallen angel, was there and promised to take care of all the ghosts that were in the Land of the Dead. So now we are back in the land of the living, and we are now going to be trying to reunite with our fellow siblings, Ludmilla and Albert and the Wentar, who went to go and try and get Martin back. So, we're going to find out what happens after we get out of the land of the dead. Chapter 17, Grandpa. When I opened my eyes, I saw nothing but deep blackness. For a minute, I feared we hadn't made it back after all. Then I remembered we had left our bodies in the sub-basement of Morley Manor, and that the place was completely dark. I heard Sarah stirring beside me. "Anthony," she whispered, "are you there?" "I'm here," I said quietly. "Did all that really happen?" "I think so." "It was real," said Gaspar. I heard him fumbling around. He struck a match. Even though it was a tiny flame, in the darkness its sudden flare seemed horribly bright. As I blinked against it, I saw that Melisande was sitting up, brushing herself off. Bob was still lying on his side, twitching and whining. Grandma was not moving at all. I scrambled to my feet to see if she was okay. As I did, I heard a familiar voice cry, "Ethel, Ethel, are you all right?" I stopped dead, so to speak. "Grandpa?" I said softly. "Grandpa, is that you?" "Uh-huh." He sounded subdued, embarrassed almost. "Where are you?" I heard Gaspar curse as the match's flame reached his fingertips. He dropped it. We were in darkness again. "Anthony, who are you talking to?" asked Sarah. Grandma moaned. "Thank goodness she's alive," said Grandpa. "Where are you?" I shouted. "Right here," said Sarah. "Not you," I snapped. "Grandpa." "I'm right here too," said Grandpa. Suddenly, I realized what he meant. Horrified, I grabbed the sides of my head and shouted, "What are you doing in there?" He sighed. "I'm sorry, Anthony. Whatever Ivanoma did when it sent you all the way back, it made it possible for me to, well, sort of hitch a ride with you. I landed in your body." "You what?" Grandpa sighed. "I didn't mean to do it. I'm not even sure how it happened, except that I've missed your grandmother so much. I think maybe having been so close to her, having seen her again, I just couldn't let her go. So I came along for the ride." "But this is—" I was interrupted by someone shaking me. "Anthony," said Gaspar sharply, "are you all right?" He had found the flashlight. A dim yellow glow filled the cellar. Suddenly I realized that I had been talking to Grandpa out loud. His answers had all been inside my head. It must have sounded as if I lost my mind. "Don't tell them I'm here," said Grandpa urgently. "What?" "Your grandmother won't like it. She'll be mad. Please, Anthony, I'll leave as soon as I can." I didn't say anything for a minute. "Please!" I sighed. Grandpa had always been good to me. What was I going to do, tattle on him? Send him back to the land of the dead? "We'll talk about this later," I thought, hoping he would understand me if I spoke one in my head. "Thanks, Anthony. You're a good boy." Well, obviously, he could understand my thoughts. Out loud I said, "Sorry, Gaspar. Guess I was woozy from the trip." "Speak up, Anthony," said a voice from below me. "Grandma," I cried, "you're all right." "Well, mostly," she said. "My hearing is gone again. Too bad about that. No surprise, though." She started to stand up. "Help her," said Grandpa. But Gaspar beat me to it. I could sense Grandpa's annoyance. "He was always after her," he muttered. I doubted that Gaspar was still interested in Grandma now that she was more than 50 years older than she had been when he last saw her. Then I wondered if Grandpa had picked up on that thought. He didn't mention it if he had. "Well," said Grandma, once she was on her feet again, "I must say I never expected anything like this when I told your parents I would watch you children for the weekend." Her voice was kind of shaky, for which I couldn't blame her. "We'd better get upstairs," said Gaspar. He sounded a little shaky too, which made me nervous. Since he was the closest thing we had to a leader, I wonder when we'll get the others back. What did he say, or what he didn't say, but what I suspected was on his mind was that it wasn't just a question of when the others would get back. It was a question of if. What would happen if the Wentar, Albert, and Ludmilla were caught in Vlinduvia? Maybe that's why he was shaky. After all, this was his family we were talking about. As it turned out, the return of the others was one thing we didn't have to worry about. When we got upstairs, all the way upstairs, to Gaspar's lab, we found Albert, Ludmilla, and the Wentar waiting for us. With them was a skinny, dark-haired boy, not much older than me. He was dressed in a one-piece outfit that looked as if someone had made a pair of coveralls out of blue aluminum foil. "Martin!" cried Gaspar in astonishment. "Martin?" echoed Sarah and Grandma, echoed Sarah, Grandma, and I all at the same time. Actually, Grandpa said it too, but I was the only one who could hear him. "But he's just a kid," I said. "Of course he's still a youngster," said the Wentar, who was standing behind the boy, looking gloomy as usual. He had been suspended in animation for nearly a century. Martin was staring up at Gaspar with an expression that seemed half fearful, half hungry. Suddenly, I realized how strange it must be for this boy to see his twin as a grown man. It was a good thing Gaspar had at least gotten rid of his lizard head, something Ludmilla and Albert had only seemed moderately surprised to notice. Martin uttered a few words in a foreign language. That was a surprise, but only because I was being sort of stupid. Of course he spoke a foreign language. The Vlinduvians had kidnapped him when he was still a kid living in Transylvania, and they had him suspended animated ever since. What did I think he would speak? Basic American? The second and much bigger surprise came when Gaspar answered in the same language, and I realized I could understand it. I blinked and looked at Sarah. She appeared to be startled as well. Then she smiled. "The translation spell," she exclaimed. "It's still working." What Gaspar said was, "So, the big brother is now the little brother, and the little, the big. Welcome back to the world we know, Martin." Martin's face quavered. I thought for a moment he was going to cry, but then he got control of himself, as if it was his face, frozen in place. I had enough sense of Gaspar by now to realize that normally he would try to comfort a kid who was feeling as bad as Martin seemed to. But Martin wasn't just any kid. Not only was he Gaspar's twin brother, he was, or had been, the just barely older brother. And from what Gaspar had told us, Martin had always taken advantage of that fact. Not only that, during the 16 years that had passed between the time Martin fell into Vlinduvia and the time that his replacement clone shrank and froze Gaspar and the others, the family had lived with the belief that the clone was the real Martin. What a mess. No wonder they all seemed to have feelings that were, to say the least, confused. I tried to imagine what it would be like for me to go to sleep some night and wake up to find my little sister was now a 26-year-old woman. The idea gave me the willies, and I figured that it would have been even weirder if she had been my twin. And weirder still if I had first been rescued from an alien planet and dragged back to a foreign country by someone like the Wentar. I couldn't blame poor Martin for looking like he wanted to cry. It was Ludmilla who broke the moment. She went to Martin and put her arms around him. "Poor little brother," she whispered. This gesture might have been more comforting to Martin if she had not shown her vampire fangs. Looking startled, he pulled away from her. "Leave me alone," he shouted. Then he put his face in his hands and began to sob. Her own lips quivering, Ludmilla dropped her hands to her side and stepped back. At the same time, Gaspar went to stand beside Martin. He said nothing, only put one hand gently on the boy's shoulder. Martin pushed away and bolted for the door. Albert and I both started after him. Before we had taken 2 steps, the Wentar raised his hand and made a weird gesture. Martin slumped to the floor. Bob dropped into a crouch and growled at the Wentar. "What have you done?" cried Melisande. "It is merely a spell of sleep," said the Wentar quietly. "He will rest in comfort while we talk, and we must talk, for there is a great deal to say and not much time to say it." "Who's the tall bossy guy?" asked Grandpa. "It's a long story," I thought back. "It's all right. I think I can figure it out on my own if I just look around in here a bit." I blinked and shook my head. "Hey, no fair poking around in my head without permission." "It's all right, Anthony. Believe me, once you're dead, you find a lot of stuff you used to take seriously isn't really all that important. For example, I already stumbled across a memory that told me that it was you who broke the cellar window 3 years ago. I would have been mad at the time. Now, there's more important stuff to worry about. I started to answer him, but the Wentar recaptured our attention by saying, Martin has already given us some vital information, namely why the Flinduvians want Earth's dead. And just why is that? Asked Gaspar. They intend to use them to reanimate dead Flinduvian warriors. Well, that's just silly, said Melisande. If they can do that, why don't they just use the souls of their own dead? The Wentar made a sniffing sound. A more cynical being than I might say it is because Flinduvians have no souls. However, like most simple answers, that is not accurate. The real reason is much more complicated. He glanced over at Martin as if to make sure he was still asleep, and then continued. Though the starry doors provide a wonderful way to travel from world to world, that very ease of transport carries with it the possibility of evil. Why? Asked Sarah. Because if it were unlimited, it would allow renegade planets to launch massive invasions of other worlds without warning. Of course, the cotillion doesn't have many planets like that, since we carefully screen worlds before we allow them access to the doors. Even so, errors sometimes happen. Like the Flinduvians? Asked Gaspar. Precisely, said the Wentar. Allowing the creatures of the red haze into the coalition of civilized worlds was one of our few mistakes, and one of our worst. They are subdued now, and have been for some time, but their planet is a world where great evil lies sleeping. It would not take much to waken it, for the Flinduvians have a lust for conquest. To guard against such peoples using the doors improperly, those who designed them specified that no more than 10 members of a species can pass through a gate on any given day. I still don't understand what this has to do with Earth's ghost, I said. I'll be glad to explain, snarled a voice from behind me. I turned, then screamed. The Flinduvians had arrived. Chapter 18, The Flinduvian Plan. The first time I saw a Flinduvian, it had been tearing its way through the barrier that separated the magical corridor leading out of Morley Manor from our own world. I had gotten only a peek then, because just as the alien was breaking through, we had fled through the starry door. That brief sight had been fairly terrifying. Even so, it had not prepared me for the full horror of the Flinduvians. To begin with, they were big, between 6 and 8 feet tall. Of course, Gaspar and the Wentar were tall too, but they didn't have biceps like basketballs and thighs as big around as my waist. We're not talking fat thighs either. I could see that they were solid muscle, or whatever Flinduvians have, because the alien's uniform consisted of nothing more than tight-fitting shorts, broad silver armbands, and chest harnesses to hold weapons and ammunition. They didn't even wear shoes, which you would think would be a basic item for warrior types. At least you would think that if you hadn't seen the Flinduvian's foot, which is sort of like a horse's hoof made long and flexible. Their fingers were even more flexible, because they weren't really fingers, but scale-covered tentacles. What really gives me the creeps is that the tentacles were of different lengths and thicknesses. I figured this meant they had specialized uses, something I decided to not think about too much. The Flinduvians' muscles weren't the only things that bulged. They also had bulging snouts and eyes. All in all, they were pretty ugly. Mom had always told us not to judge people by their looks, but I was having a hard time following that advice right then. Not only did the Flinduvians look big, mean, and nasty, my gut was telling me they probably acted the same way. There were 10 of them, and they pretty much filled the room. The guy at the front, who I assumed was their leader, smiled. I wished he hadn't. Not because of the 2 rows of silvery fangs, though they were bad enough. No, it was the black, snaky tongue flicking out of its mouth that really got to me. It was far more horrible and frightening than Gaspar's had been, probably because it had 2 big holes in the end of it, holes that opened and closed like a sniffing nostril. The plan is simple, he said in a voice that sounded like pebbles being run through a blender. While no more than 10 members of a species may pass through the gate, that restriction applies only to the living. We can transport as many corpses as we wish. Once we have them here, we can inject them with the spirits of Earth's dead and bring them back to life. What good will that do you? Asked Gaspar. You can't expect Earth's dead to fight on your behalf. They'll have no choice, said the Flinduvian cheerfully. All we need is their life force to animate the body. Once we install them, their actions will be completely under our control. And where are you going to get an army's worth of corpses? Asked Gaspar. The alien smiled again. No Flinduvian hesitates to die in the service of his planet. When the call goes out for bodies, our biggest problem will be sorting through the many volunteers eager to earn a spot in warrior heaven. Such a death is a great honor, a privilege. If you can put a soul into a body, why don't you just reinsert the one that was there to begin with? Asked Ludmilla. The leader sneered. Once a body has died, reinstalling a soul can give it power and movement, but not genuine life. These reanimates will be mere zombies. He didn't actually use the word zombie, of course, since he was speaking in Flinduvian, but that was the sense of it. To be trapped in such a thing is not a proper fate for the soul of a Flinduvian hero. It would be an insult to his honor. That's why it was such a great boost to our plans when we captured young Martin there. By studying him, we eventually discovered what an absurdly strong connection to life the ghosts of this miserable, long-ignored little planet of yours possess. Strong enough to make them cling to even an alien body. It makes them perfect for our uses. He threw back his head and laughed. At least I think it was a laugh. The actual sound was sort of a cross between a chainsaw and a werewolf gargling. Now at last Flinduvia will rise from her slumber. Now we wake and the galaxy trembles. I heard a groan and turned to see Martin push himself into a kneeling position. Melisande started toward him. Don't move, snapped the Flinduvian. Martin looked up at the sound of his voice. Oh, it's you, Dice Rock. It's about time. I was wondering when you were going to get here. Martin, what are you talking about? Cried Gaspar. Be quiet, you fool, snapped the boy. Why do you think I let the Wentar bring me back here? Does the word bait mean anything to you? Melisande started to cry. Grandma put an arm around her shoulder. That's my Ethel, thought Grandpa, always worried about others. Though he didn't say anything else, I caught a note of terror running beneath his thoughts. He was right to be terrified. The very moment he sent those words to me, one of the Flinduvian's armbands began to beep. Dice Rock smiled. His tongue flicked out. Well, he said happily, it looks as if we have a ghost near us right now. Might as well collect it while we have the chance. Who knows when it might be useful? The Flinduvian behind him, the one with the beeping armband, turned in a slow circle. When he was facing in my direction, the armband began to beep more loudly. His blue face creased in one of these horrible, tongue-flicking smiles, and he stepped towards me. The beeping increased. Dice Rock looked puzzled. Are you harboring one of the dead, boy? I shook my head, trying to look both innocent and stupid. It did no good, the Flinduvian with the armband raised his hand. He was holding something shaped like a big squirt gun, colorful and bulgy, with a wide mouth at one end and a yellow bottle-like thing on the other. He smiled, his snaky tongue flicking out at me. The big black holes in its tip opened and closed like sniffing nostrils. Come out, wherever you are, he called mockingly. Then he pointed the collecting gun at my head and pulled the trigger. Alright, so it sounds like they're going after Grandpa, but Anthony is the only one that knew Grandpa was in there, so we're going to have to find out what happens, and we're going to find that out next time. Bye, guys.